My son convinced my husband to divorce me at 74. We'll split all her property and $5 million in half. At 74, he took everything from me. I silently packed my suitcase and disappeared. But a week later, a notary knocked on their door with documents that changed everything. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to believe that 52 years of marriage was proof enough, proof that a man loved you, proof that you had built something real, something that couldn't be undone by a bad season or a careless word. Raymond and I had weathered all of it. The lean years when he was building his contracting business from nothing, the loss of our second child before she ever drew a breath, the slow drift that sometimes comes in middle age when you look across the dinner table and wonder if you still know the person sitting there. We always found our way back. That was what I believed. Our home was a colonial on Birchwood Lane in Asheville, North Carolina. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, the rose garden I had planted the summer our son Derek turned 3. Raymond had built that house with his own crews, and I had made it into the kind of place that people felt the moment they stepped through the door. Warm, settled, earned. We were comfortable, more than comfortable. Over 50 years, Raymond's business had grown into something substantial, and we had been careful with money in the way that people who once didn't have it tend to be. The accounts, the properties, the investments, it all amounted to something close to $5 million by the time we reached our 70s. We never spoke about it much. It simply existed, the way the house existed, the way our marriage existed. As a fact, Derek was our only surviving child. He was 51 years old, and I want to be honest with you. I had been watching him with a quiet unease for most of his adult life. Not because he was cruel, he wasn't, not openly, but because of the way he calculated, the way his eyes moved when money was mentioned. He had his father's jaw and his father's confidence, but underneath it was something that didn't belong to Raymond at all, a kind of patience that wasn't really patience. It was waiting. He had never been good with his own finances. 2 failed businesses, a divorce that cost him significantly, a lifestyle that always seemed to exceed what he earned. Raymond bailed him out more than once. I said little. You don't want to be the mother who poisons her husband against his son. So I watched, and I said little, and I told myself it would be fine. The first sign came in February, about 8 months before everything broke open. Derek started coming around more. That alone wasn't unusual. He lived 40 minutes away in Weaverville, and he had always visited on Sundays. But these weren't Sunday visits. He was coming on Tuesday evenings, on Thursday afternoons. And when he came, he and Raymond would sit in Raymond's study with the door closed. Raymond had never been a man who closed doors in his own house. I didn't ask directly. I brought them coffee once, and Raymond looked up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. And Derek shifted in his chair in a way that I recognized. The way a person shifts when they've been talking about someone who just walked in. I set the coffee down and left. I stood in the hallway for a moment outside the closed door, and I thought, something is happening in there. Over the following weeks, Raymond became quieter with me, not hostile. Raymond was never a man who raised his voice, but there was a new distance, as if he were measuring his words before he offered them. He stopped asking my opinion about things he had always asked me about. The investment accounts, the property taxes, the question of whether to sell the lake cabin up in Tennessee. These had been joint conversations for decades. Suddenly they weren't. I began to notice other things. Raymond started taking phone calls in the garage. He changed the password on the desktop computer in the study. Small things. The kind of things a woman of 74 might be tempted to dismiss as paranoia, as the fearfulness that comes with age. I was tempted. I nearly gave in to that temptation. Then came the morning of October 14th. It was a Wednesday. I had made breakfast, eggs, toast, the grapefruit Raymond had taken every morning for 30 years. He sat down, moved the food aside without eating, and folded his hands on the table. He looked at me the way a person looks at someone they have already mentally left. "Martha," he said, "I want a divorce." I heard the words. I understood them. But for a long moment, the kitchen felt very far away, as if I were watching the scene from somewhere above it. "I've spoken with an attorney," he continued. His voice was steady, rehearsed. "I think it's the right thing. We've grown apart." Grown apart? 52 years. The baby we buried. The house on Birchwood Lane. The rose garden. Grown apart. I looked at him across the table, and I did not cry. I am not sure why. Perhaps because somewhere beneath the shock, some older, quieter part of me had already known this was coming. Had known it since February, since the closed doors, since the shifted chair. "All right," I said. I got up, washed my plate, and went upstairs. And I began, very quietly, to think. I sat on the edge of the bed in our room. My room, I was still calling it that. And I let myself feel it. Not the grief. Not yet. The grief would come later, in waves, at unexpected moments. The smell of his coffee in the morning. The particular way he cleared his throat before speaking. What I let myself feel right then was the fear. Clean, practical fear. The kind that tells you to pay attention. What did I actually have? We had been married in 1972, before North Carolina's equitable distribution laws had been fully shaped. But those laws had evolved over the decades, and I knew, in a general way, that a long marriage entitled both spouses to a fair share of marital assets. What I didn't know, what I had never had reason to examine closely, was exactly how those assets were structured, whose names were on what, which accounts had been opened when and by whom. Raymond had always managed the finances. I had been involved in the broad strokes, the major decisions, but the paperwork, the accounts, the precise architecture of our wealth, that had been Raymond's domain, and I had let it be. That, I realized sitting on the edge of that bed, had been my single greatest mistake. The house on Birchwood Lane, I believed it was in both our names. The lake cabin in Tennessee. I was less certain. The business, which Raymond had sold 8 years ago for a substantial sum, had generated investment accounts that I had seen statements for but never examined closely. There were also Raymond's pension accounts, the proceeds from 2 rental properties he'd sold in the 1990s, stock holdings I knew existed but couldn't have named precisely. $5 million, give or take. And I had let a man I trusted hold all of it in his hands. The question that kept returning, the one I couldn't push away, was, how much of this had Derek planned? Because I didn't for one moment believe that Raymond, at 76, had woken up one morning and decided to dismantle 52 years of marriage on his own. Raymond was many things, but impulsive wasn't one of them. Someone had worked on him. Someone had spent months sitting in that study with the door closed, building a case, reframing decades of shared life as something to be escaped. My son had convinced my husband to leave me. I said it to myself plainly, without softening it, because I needed to feel the full shape of the thing I was dealing with. I spent the rest of that Wednesday in a kind of controlled stillness. I did not confront Raymond. I did not call Derek. I went downstairs at lunchtime, made myself a sandwich, and ate it at the kitchen table while Raymond was out. In the afternoon, I drove to the public library on Pack Square. Not the nearest branch, not the one where the librarians knew my face. And I used one of their computers to search for family law attorneys in Asheville. I was looking for a woman. I can't fully explain why, except that I knew what I was walking into was going to require someone who understood, without my having to explain it, what it meant to have trusted a man for 50 years and find yourself holding nothing. I found her, Patricia Holloway, of Holloway and Crane family law. 23 years of practice, a particular focus on asset division in long-term marriages. I wrote down her number on a slip of paper, put it in the inner pocket of my cardigan, and drove home. That night, Raymond and I had dinner in near silence. He asked if I wanted more water. I said no, thank you. We watched the evening news separately. He in the study, I in the sitting room, and went to bed at different times. I lay in the dark and listened to the unfamiliar sound of my own house, and I made myself a promise. I was not going to disappear quietly. The next morning, while Raymond was at his Thursday golf game, I called Patricia Holloway's office and made an appointment for the following Monday. I told the receptionist it was urgent. She gave me a 9 a.m. slot. I spent the weekend being careful. I acted as I always had, made meals, tended the garden, asked Raymond about his golf game. I also, quietly, began to gather. I went through the filing cabinet in Raymond's study when he was napping, photographing documents with my phone, bank statements, property deeds, investment account summaries, the mortgage documents paid off 15 years ago, an LLC filing I didn't recognize, dated 3 years back, with Derek's name on it alongside Raymond's. That last one made my hands go cold. An LLC, formed 3 years ago, that I had never been told about. I photographed every page and went back to the sitting room and sat very still for a while. By Sunday evening, I had the outline of a plan. It wasn't complete. There were things I didn't understand, things I would need Patricia Holloway to explain to me. But I knew its shape. I was not going to accept whatever Raymond and Derek had arranged. I was going to find out exactly what existed, and I was going to protect what was mine, and I was going to do it before anyone realized I had started. The appointment was Monday at 9 a.m. I set my alarm and went to sleep. Patricia Holloway's office was on the 4th floor of a building on Lexington Avenue. The kind of office that was deliberately understated. Clean lines, good light, no excess. She was in her mid-50s, with reading glasses she wore on a chain, and a manner that was precise without being cold. She looked at the photographs I had printed at the library that morning, spread them across her desk one by one, and didn't say anything for a long time. Then she said, "How much of this did you know about before last week?" "Almost none of it," I said. She nodded, as if this were not surprising. "The LLC," she said, tapping the filing I had photographed in the study. "This is a real estate holding company. It was formed 3 years ago. Your name is not on it." "I know. Were any marital assets transferred into it?" "I don't know," I said. "That's what I need to find out." She told me what she could do and what it would require. A formal discovery process, once divorce proceedings were underway, would compel Raymond to disclose all assets. But she also recommended that I act quickly on several fronts before that process began. Specifically, that I consult with a separate estate attorney about my own documents, and that I begin gathering any financial records I could access legally and immediately. She also told me something I hadn't fully understood. In North Carolina, assets that were transferred out of marital property within 3 years before a divorce filing could potentially be subject to challenge depending on the circumstances and intent. 3 years? The LLC had been formed 3 years ago. I drove home steadier than I had been in days. What I didn't know, and wouldn't know until later, was that Raymond had noticed the filing cabinet was slightly out of order. He was a precise man, and he kept his papers in a specific arrangement. When he opened the cabinet that Monday morning and found the folders fractionally shifted, he knew. He didn't say anything to me. He called Derek instead. I found this out eventually. At the time, I only noticed that Raymond seemed watchful at dinner that evening. His eyes rested on me a moment too long. I kept my face still and talked about the garden. The following Thursday, I had my second appointment with Patricia, this time accompanied by a fuller set of documents. I had found, tucked in the back of a folder marked Insurance 2019. A set of bank statements for an account I had never seen before. A savings account, opened in Raymond's name only 8 years ago, the same year he sold the business. The balance, as of the most recent statement I had found, was just over $400,000. A second account, a brokerage, had been opened the following year. Another name was listed as beneficiary, Derek's name. Patricia looked at the statements and then at me. "This account predates the LLC," she said carefully, "but it's still something we'll want to examine closely in discovery." I left her office and sat in my car in the parking garage for several minutes. I wasn't crying. I was past crying. I was moving through something harder than grief now, something that had a different texture. It was the feeling of a person who has been standing on ground they believed was solid and has looked down to find it has been slowly undermined for years. How long had Derek been planning this? How long had Raymond been willing? That afternoon, I drove not home, but to the Radio Shack on Merriman Avenue. It was still there, barely, in those days. And I bought a small digital recorder. I wasn't sure what I intended to do with it. I told myself I was being paranoid. I drove home and put the recorder in my cardigan pocket. I didn't have to wait long. That Saturday, Derek came for one of his now frequent visits. He and Raymond went to the study as usual. I made coffee, carried it down the hall, and stopped outside the door. My hands were steady. I had not planned what happened next, or perhaps some part of me had, in the way that the body sometimes knows before the mind catches up. I pressed the recorder. I stood in the hall for 6 minutes. The sound quality was imperfect, muffled through the door, but it was enough. Derek's voice, slightly louder than Raymond's. "She doesn't know about the Tennessee property transfer, does she? As long as we file before she gets an attorney, the 60-day window means the LLC holds enough that even with equitable distribution she ends up with." And Raymond's voice, quieter, a voice I had loved for 52 years. "She won't fight it. You know how she is. She won't fight it." I walked back to the kitchen. I set the coffee tray down. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the rose garden, the one I had planted when Derek was 3 years old, and I felt something settle in me. Not rage, not grief. Something colder and more useful than either. They thought they knew how I was. They were about to learn otherwise. Patricia had advised me to move carefully and in sequence. The first step, she said, was to secure my own independent documentation, to ensure that whatever assets were legitimately in my name or jointly held were properly recorded and that I had legal standing to access them. The second step was to file a formal response to whatever Raymond's attorney initiated. The third, and this required a separate consultation which she arranged, was to visit an estate attorney named George Harlan, who worked 2 floors above her in the same building. George Harlan was a quiet man in his 60s with an old-fashioned courtesy that I found, in that particular season, extremely comforting. I brought him a copy of my existing will. Raymond and I had made wills together in 2009, straightforward documents that left everything to each other, with Derek as sole beneficiary after both of us were gone. And I told him I wanted to revise it. Completely. He asked me what I had in mind. I told him. What I had learned, through 2 weeks of conversations with Patricia and my own quiet research, was that I had more independent standing than Derek had apparently accounted for. The house on Birchwood Lane was in both names. Several of the older investment accounts, ones Raymond and I had opened together in the 1980s and 1990s, were joint accounts with right of survivorship. These were marital assets, subject to equitable distribution, and while I might not receive exactly half of everything, I was entitled to a fair share of the marital estate built over 52 years. What Derek had not counted on, what Raymond had apparently not told him, or perhaps had forgotten, was a separate financial decision I had made completely on my own. 11 years earlier. My mother had died in 2012 and left me, her only daughter, the proceeds from the sale of her house in Charlotte. $160,000. I had deposited it into an account in my name only, had invested it carefully and quietly over the years, and had never commingled it with our joint finances. Separate property. Mine alone. That account over 11 years had grown. I revised my will. I established a trust. I made specific designations that would not be easily undone or challenged. George Harlan notarized everything on a Tuesday afternoon in early November, and I drove home feeling, for the first time in weeks, like solid ground was somewhere beneath my feet again. I was not prepared for what happened 2 days later. I was in the kitchen on Thursday morning when Derek's car pulled into the driveway. He didn't knock. He had a key. Had always had a key. And he came through the back door with Raymond behind him, and they stood in my kitchen with the air of men who had rehearsed something. Derek said, "We know you've been to see an attorney." I said, "Good morning, Derek." "Mom." His voice shifted into something softer, practiced. "We should talk about this like adults. You're making this harder than it needs to be. Dad just wants—" "I know what your father wants," I said. "He told me himself." "The point is," Derek said, and the softness dropped, "that if you try to drag this into a long legal fight, the costs come out of the estate, out of both your shares. You're hurting yourself." I looked at my son. I thought about the recording in my cardigan drawer upstairs. I thought about the LLC. I thought about she won't fight it. "I appreciate your concern," I said. Raymond hadn't spoken. He was standing near the door with an expression I couldn't read. Not guilt exactly, but something uncomfortable, as though he had walked into a room and found it arranged differently than he'd expected. Derek's tone hardened. "If you push this, you should know that we have documentation showing that a significant amount of the household spending over the past 20 years was disproportionate. Attorneys can argue dissipation. Your spending on the house, the garden, the—" "Derek," I said very quietly, "I have an attorney. She is very good. I suggest that any further conversation about the legal specifics go through her." There was a silence in my kitchen that had weight to it. Derek looked at Raymond. Raymond looked at the floor. Then Derek said, more quietly, "You're making a mistake." And they left. I stood at the kitchen window again after their car pulled out. My heart was beating harder than I would have liked. But my hands, I noticed, were still. I called Patricia and told her what had happened. She advised me to document the visit, date, time, what was said, by whom. I did. Then she said something that mattered. "Martha, you've done what you needed to do. Now I need you to step back for a few days and let me work." "Can you do that?" I said I could. I packed a bag that afternoon and drove to my friend Eleanor's house in Hendersonville, 30 miles south. Eleanor had been my closest friend for 40 years. She had lost her own husband 6 years earlier, not to divorce, but to a heart attack, and she understood things without my having to explain them. I stayed with Eleanor for 4 days. We drank tea and watched old films and walked by the French Broad River in the November cold. I did not look at my phone any more than necessary. I slept 8 hours each night for the first time in weeks. When I drove back to Birchwood Lane on Monday morning, I felt rested. I felt ready. And I had decided something, quietly, during those 4 days by the river. I was going to see this through to the end. The call came on a Wednesday, 2 weeks after my return from Hendersonville. It was Derek, and he was using the voice again, the softer one, the one that had probably worked on Raymond over all those months in the closed study. "Mom, I've been thinking," he said. "I think we went about this wrong. Dad and I both agree that you deserve to be taken care of. We're not trying to leave you with nothing. We were thinking a settlement, outside of court, something fair. You keep the house. We liquidate some of the other assets and split them cleanly. You'd walk away with the home and something in the range of 800,000. You could live very comfortably. 800,000. Out of an estate that Patricia now estimated, based on what we had been able to document, at between 4.8 and 5.2 million dollars. I let Derek finish. Then I said, "I'll pass that along to my attorney." "Mom?" A pause. "I'm trying to help you here." "I know you are," I said. I hung up and wrote down the time, the offer, and the exact language he had used. I sent the notes to Patricia by email within the hour. What Derek had offered, and I understood this clearly by then, was not generosity. It was a calculation. If I accepted 800,000 and the house, Raymond and Derek would retain control of the remaining 4 million or so, including whatever was in the LLC and the separate accounts. They were counting on my not fully understanding what I was entitled to, on my being frightened enough of a long legal process to take a fraction of what was actually mine. "She won't fight it." Patricia responded to my email within an hour. "Do not engage further directly. I'll send a formal response to Raymond's attorney." I put my phone down and looked around the sitting room. My sitting room, the one I had furnished over the course of 30 years, the reading chair by the window, the photographs on the mantel. My life was in this house. But I was no longer confused about what the house represented to Derek and Raymond. It was a line item, a way to get me to stop asking questions. It was also around this time that I called Lindy. Linda, everyone called her Lindy, was Raymond's daughter from his first marriage. She was 58 years old, lived in Raleigh, and Raymond had maintained a complicated, intermittent relationship with her since her parents divorced in the 1970s. I had always liked Lindy. She was forthright in a way that her half-brother was not. Derek had never liked her. I called her on a Thursday evening and told her, as plainly as I could, what had happened. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Martha, I want you to know something. Derek called me about 2 months ago. He was asking about my inheritance expectations, what I thought I was entitled to from Dad's estate." I held the phone and let that settle. "He was mapping the field," she said, "figuring out who the obstacles were." Lindy drove up from Raleigh the following weekend. We sat at my kitchen table, and she told me what she knew, which wasn't everything, but was enough. Enough to confirm the shape of what I had already understood. Derek had been working on Raymond for at least 18 months. He had presented it, Lindy believed, as estate planning, protecting the assets from taxation, from complication, rationalizing the transfers as prudent financial management. Raymond, who was 76 and whose health had been quietly declining in ways I had noticed and worried about, had been susceptible in a way he might not have been 10 years earlier. "He's not a bad man," Lindy said about her father. She said it carefully, like she meant it, but was aware of its limits. "No," I agreed, "he isn't." We weren't making excuses. We were just being accurate. Lindy was not a party to the divorce proceedings, but she was willing to provide a written account of Derek's call to her, what he had asked, and how he had framed it. Patricia said this could be relevant, depending on how things developed. It was not a smoking gun, but it was another piece of the picture. After Lindy left on Sunday afternoon, I sat in the garden for a while, even though it was November and cold. The roses cut back for the season, the beds covered in mulch. I had planted this garden the summer Derek was 3. He used to come out and hand me tools when he was small, not knowing what any of them were, just wanting to be near me. I thought about that child for a moment. Then I let him go. I had work to do. They came on a Saturday in December, 3 weeks before the first formal hearing date Patricia had scheduled. I had known, in a loose way, that another approach was coming. Derek was not the kind of man who accepted a closed door without trying it again. But I had not expected Raymond to come with him. Raymond had been communicating only through his attorney for over a month. I opened the front door, and there they both were on my porch, in the December cold, and Raymond was holding a poinsettia. A poinsettia. As if this were a social call. As if we were neighbors dropping by for coffee. As if the past 3 months had been a minor misunderstanding rather than a calculated dismantling of everything I had spent my adult life helping to build. I stood in the doorway and looked at them. "Martha," Raymond said, "could we come in? Just to talk." I wanted to say no. Every sensible instinct told me to say no. But I also understood something about how these things worked. That if I could hear what they said, I would know more than I did right now. So I stepped back and let them in. We sat in the sitting room, my sitting room, with the reading chair and the photographs. And Raymond set the poinsettia on the side table and folded his hands the way he had at the kitchen table in October. And Derek leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and they began. The approach was softer than the kitchen visit. That was the first thing I noticed. Derek talked about family, about what a long divorce proceeding would do to all of them, to the legacy of what Raymond had built. He talked about stress. My stress, pointedly, as though at 74 I should be thinking about my blood pressure rather than my financial future. He said the word dignity twice, in the context of settling things privately, among family, rather than in a courtroom. He spoke slowly and deliberately, choosing each word the way a man chooses his footing on ice. Carefully, with an awareness of what breaking through might mean. Then came the part that was meant to move me. Raymond said, "Martha, I know I've hurt you. I know this hasn't been handled right." He paused. "But I also think, at our age, what we both need is peace, not a fight. You've always been sensible. You've always known what mattered." I looked at my husband of 52 years, and I heard what he was actually saying underneath the words. Be sensible. Be quiet. Know your place. Don't make this difficult. They had dressed it up in the language of reconciliation, but what they were offering was still surrender. And the particular cruelty of it, though I don't think Raymond experienced it as cruelty, was that they were using the qualities I had genuinely possessed, my patience, my steadiness, my preference for peace, as instruments against me, turning my own character into the mechanism of my defeat. Derek said, "If you drop the counterfiling and agree to the original settlement terms, we're prepared to increase the offer. 1.1 million plus the house outright. No legal fees, clean division, done by February. 1.1 million, up from 800,000. Still less than a quarter of the estate." "And the LLC?" I said. Derek's expression shifted slightly. "The LLC holds business assets that predate the marriage in terms of—" "The LLC was formed 3 years ago," I said, "during our marriage, using funds that were part of our joint estate. Patricia has the documentation." There was a silence. Raymond looked at Derek. Derek looked at me with an expression I recognized. I had seen it when he was 12 years old and had been caught in a lie and was calculating his next move. The same slight tightening around the eyes. The same fraction of a second where the mask slipped before he could reposition it. "We can discuss the LLC in the context of a full settlement," Derek said carefully. "That's all we're saying. Come to the table. Work with us." "I am working with my attorney," I said. "If you'd like to make a revised offer, have Raymond's attorney contact Patricia Holloway." Derek stood up. The calm was gone. "Mom, I have to tell you, you are making this so much worse than it has to be. You think you have something here, but you're a 74-year-old woman going up against—" He stopped himself. But we all knew what the end of that sentence was. "A 74-year-old woman," Raymond said. "Derek, a warning." Derek picked up his jacket. "I hope you think hard about what you actually want," he said to me, "because what you're doing is going to leave everyone worse off, including you." He went to the front door and I heard it close behind him. Not a slam, which might have been easier to dismiss, but a firm, deliberate click. The sound of a man who believes he has said the final word. Raymond stayed for a moment. He looked at the poinsettia. He looked at me. He looked at the photograph on the mantel. The two of us at our 30th anniversary, the restaurant in Charleston, both of us laughing at something I could no longer remember. Then he looked at me again, and for just a second, I thought I saw something in his face that might have been shame. Not regret for the plan itself, perhaps, but regret for the particular way it had just been revealed. The stripped-down version of it, standing in a room full of our shared history, with his son's unfinished sentence still in the air. Then he got up and followed Derek out the door. I sat in the sitting room after they left and listened to the sound of their car reversing down the driveway. The poinsettia sat on the side table. I looked at it for a long moment, red and incongruous and utterly beside the point. And then I became aware that my hands were trembling slightly. Not from weakness, but from adrenaline, from the particular physical response to sustained threat that the body cannot entirely suppress no matter how still you keep your face. A 74-year-old woman. I let that sentence do what it was going to do inside me. I let myself feel the fear of it. The fear of being dismissed, outmaneuvered, made irrelevant. The fear of the legal costs, the timeline, the uncertainty. The fear of sitting in that courtroom and having a stranger read documents that quantified my 52 years of marriage into columns and figures. The fear, underneath all the others, of being wrong, of having misjudged what I had and what I was owed. And then I picked up my phone and texted Patricia. They came. I have notes. Can we meet Monday? Her response came within minutes. I'll be there. You did exactly right. I put the phone down. The trembling had stopped, and the fear, I noticed, had not disappeared. It had changed into something else, something with more weight to it, more traction. I had felt it before, in smaller versions throughout my life. The feeling that comes when you have been told you cannot do something and discovered somewhere in your body that you absolutely can. That the word cannot has been placed in front of you not as a fact, but as a test. And the test has a correct answer, and you know what it is. The first formal hearing was 3 weeks away. I went to the kitchen, moved the poinsettia to the counter where I wouldn't have to look at it, and made tea. And I began, very quietly, to prepare. The hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in January at the Buncombe County Courthouse on College Street. Patricia had spent the preceding 3 weeks in intensive preparation, and so had I. George Harlan had finalized all documentation related to my trust and revised estate planning. Patricia had filed our formal discovery responses and, more importantly, had filed a motion challenging the asset transfers into the LLC on the grounds of potential dissipation of marital assets, a legal term that I had not known 3 months ago and now understood precisely. Raymond's attorney, a man named Caldwell, efficient and expensive-looking in the way of men who bill by 6-minute increments, had filed a counter-motion arguing that the LLC represented legitimate business restructuring and predated any marital discord. Patricia had a response ready for that, too. What Caldwell did not know, and what Raymond and Derek presumably had not told him, was the recording. Patricia had spent considerable time with an audio specialist and a legal consultant working out exactly how the recording could be introduced and what it could support. North Carolina is a one-party consent state for recording. I had been present in the hallway, I had not been trespassing in my own home, and the recording captured a conversation to which I was effectively a party by physical proximity. It was not perfect. Nothing in real legal proceedings ever is. But it was enough to support a serious argument that the transfers into the LLC had been made with deliberate intent to reduce my share of the marital estate. Enough to demonstrate that the framing of this divorce as a mutual, natural conclusion to a long marriage was not the full picture. The morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully. A charcoal wool suit I had owned for years, a strand of pearls that had been my mother's. I stood in front of the mirror for a moment and looked at myself. 74 years old, steady-eyed, wearing my mother's pearls in a courthouse in January. And I thought, this is exactly where you are supposed to be. I was not trying to perform anything. I simply wanted to look like what I was. A woman who had been married for 52 years and who knew exactly what she was owed. The hearing room was smaller than I had expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent light, the particular stillness of official proceedings that reminds you, usefully, that this is a place where consequences are real and permanent. Raymond came in with Caldwell and sat across the aisle. He did not look at me when he sat down, which told me something. Derek was not present. He was not a party to the divorce, technically. But I saw him in the corridor when I arrived, standing near the water fountain with his arms crossed, and our eyes met for a moment. He looked as though he had not slept well. I held his gaze for 2 full seconds, and then walked past him into the hearing room. The hearing began with procedural matters. Caldwell presented Raymond's position, an equitable division of documented marital assets, with the LLC excluded on the grounds that it was a separate business entity formed for legitimate estate planning purposes. He spoke with the measured confidence of a man who has delivered similar arguments many times and expected the framework to hold. He cited precedents. He was thorough. He was also, I was about to learn, unprepared. Then Patricia stood up. She presented our documentation methodically, without drama, in the tone of a person who has the facts on her side and knows that facts do not require ornamentation. The joint accounts, their opening dates, their balances at the time of the LLC's formation, the property deeds, the timeline of the LLC's creation cross-referenced precisely against the sale of Raymond's business, the business whose proceeds had seeded the accounts from which the LLC had been funded. She presented Lindy's written account of Derek's call, noting that it demonstrated a pattern of deliberate planning that predated any claimed marital discord by over a year. She presented a forensic accountant's preliminary analysis with specific figures and transfer dates, not estimates, but documented transactions, showing that assets had been structured specifically to minimize my share of the marital estate. And then she presented the recording. Caldwell objected immediately, citing relevance and the circumstances of the capture. The judge, a woman in her early 60s named Judge Paris, with reading glasses and the unhurried manner of someone who has heard every version of every argument, listened to the objection, listened to Patricia's response, and then listened to the recording herself through headphones, in silence, twice. The courtroom was very quiet while she listened. I watched her face and learned nothing from it, which I took as a professional compliment to her. Then she made a note and asked Caldwell if he would like a brief recess for consultation with his client. Raymond and Caldwell stepped out. I sat at our table and looked at the wood grain of the surface in front of me and breathed. Patricia poured a small cup of water from the carafe and set it in front of me without comment. I drank it. Outside the high windows, I could see a strip of January sky, pale gray and entirely indifferent to the proceedings below it. They were gone for 11 minutes. When they returned, Raymond's face had a quality I had not seen on it before. Not the measured distance of the past months, not the rehearsed calm of the kitchen in October, or the calculated gentleness of the December visit with the poinsettia. This was something more exposed, something that had not been prepared for. He looked, I realized, like a man who had been told that the floor he was standing on was not as solid as he had been promised, and who was now doing the silent arithmetic of exactly how far down the drop might be. Caldwell asked for another recess, a longer one, 3 days, to review the new evidence and consult further with his client. Judge Paris granted it with a measured look that suggested she had a reasonable idea of what the consultation would involve. In the corridor afterward, Derek was still there. He had clearly been told something because his posture had changed. He was no longer leaning against the wall with his arms crossed. He was standing upright, very still, with the look of a person who is trying to reconstruct a sequence of events and finding the reconstruction uncomfortable. "You recorded us," he said. "I was in my own hallway," I said. "That's—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "Do you understand what this looks like? You were spying on your own family." I looked at my son. This man who had sat in my husband's study for months, patient and systematic, dismantling something I had spent 52 years building, who had called Lindy to map the inheritance field, who had stood in my kitchen and calculated that the offer of $800,000 was enough to make me disappear quietly, who had said, in a room he believed was private, the 4 words that had clarified everything: "She won't fight it." "Derek," I said quietly, "I know exactly what this looks like." I walked past him and out into the January air, and Patricia fell into step beside me, and neither of us said anything for half a block. The cold was sharp and clean and real. Then she said, "The 3-day recess is good for us. Caldwell knows the ground has shifted. The question now is whether Raymond accepts a real settlement, or we go back in front of Paris." "He'll settle," I said. "What makes you sure?" I thought about the look on Raymond's face when he came back into that room. The exposed look. The look of a man who had genuinely not expected to find himself accountable in quite this way. "Because he's not a bad man," I said. "He just made a very bad decision, and somewhere in there, he knows it." Patricia glanced at me. "That's a generous reading." "It's an accurate one," I said, "and either way, it doesn't change the outcome." We walked back to her office in the January cold, and I felt, for the first time in 3 months, the specific relief of a person who has been moving through uncertain terrain in the dark and has finally reached a place where she can see clearly in all directions. Raymond's attorney called Patricia on the 2nd of the 3 recess days. They were willing to settle. Properly this time. Not the $800,000, not the $1.1 million, but a genuine accounting of the marital estate in full, including the assets held in the LLC, which Patricia's forensic accountant had now traced in their entirety. The negotiation took 2 weeks. I want to be accurate about this. It was not a simple or comfortable 2 weeks. There were counterproposals that required firm responses. There were moments when Raymond's side pushed on specific asset valuations, and Patricia pushed back. There were phone calls and emails and revised documents, and I sat through all of it with a patience I had not known I possessed. In the end, the settlement agreement was signed on a Tuesday afternoon in late January in Patricia's conference room, with both attorneys present and both Raymond and I seated at opposite ends of the table. I received the house on Birchwood Lane, outright, with no mortgage. That had been settled years ago. I received 45% of the documented marital estate, which after full accounting came to just under $2.2 million. I received a portion of Raymond's pension income on a monthly basis, formalized and legally binding. And the LLC, the entity that Derek had apparently believed was the architecture of my exclusion, was unwound as part of the settlement, its assets folded back into the marital estate and divided accordingly. My independent account, the one my mother had left me, the one that had grown quietly over 11 years while Raymond and Derek were building their plans, remained entirely mine, untouched and separate. Patricia noted, with a small professional satisfaction that this account alone had grown to just over $400,000. My money, my mother's legacy. Raymond signed without speaking much. He looked tired in a way that wasn't just the hour. I felt no satisfaction in it, not exactly. What I felt was something more sober, the acknowledgement that a thing had happened and had been dealt with, and that I had not been erased. What happened to Derek requires its own accounting. He was not a direct party to the divorce settlement, but the exposure of the LLC, its formation, its funding, the transfers that had flowed through it, drew the attention of Patricia's forensic accountant to tax filings associated with the entity. She filed those concerns separately with the appropriate parties. I had nothing to do with what happened after that. But the LLC was a problem that did not end with my settlement. There was also the matter of Raymond's will. Raymond had updated his will during the months of planning. I learned this in discovery. He had made Derek the primary beneficiary of his remaining estate, removing Lindy entirely and reducing my inheritance rights to a legal minimum. Now, in the aftermath of the hearing and the settlement, Raymond was informed by Caldwell, and by the clear-eyed reality of what the recording had documented about his son's involvement, that he might want to revisit that document. Whether he did and what he decided was not my business. I had my own estate. George Harlan had seen to that. On the afternoon the settlement was signed, I drove home along the interstate and then turned off onto the familiar roads that led to Birchwood Lane, past the old church on the corner, past the Hendersons' farm with its white fence, and up the gentle slope to my house. My house now, in a way that had a legal clarity it had never quite had before. I parked in the driveway and sat for a moment. The rose beds were still covered in their winter mulch. In 3 months, they would need to be uncovered, and the new season would start, and the garden would do what it had always done: put out leaves and buds and blossoms with an indifference to everything that had happened around it. Gardens are good that way. I went inside and made tea and sat in my reading chair by the window, and I allowed myself, for the first time in 4 months, to simply sit. Not to plan, not to gather evidence or review documents or brace for the next thing, just to sit in my own house in the winter light and be. Spring came slowly to Asheville that year, the way it often does in the mountains. Tentative, retreating into cold for a week, and then advancing again, until one morning you go outside and the air has changed, and you know it's real. I uncovered the roses in late March. It was physical work, the kind that requires you to be entirely present, and I was glad of it. The months following the settlement had their own adjustments. There was the strangeness of the house with only one person in it, the particular silence of rooms that had held 2 lives for decades. There were evenings when I sat with a book I couldn't concentrate on and let myself feel the loneliness, because there's no honest way through it except to feel it. But there was also Eleanor, who drove up from Hendersonville on alternate weekends and had strong opinions about which restaurants on Lexington Avenue were worth visiting. There was Lindy, who called on Thursdays and who had become something closer to a friend than she had ever been when I was officially her stepmother. She had her own complicated feelings about Raymond and about what had happened, and we talked about them honestly, which was more than either of us had managed before. In May, I went to Portugal. I had always wanted to go and had never gone. There had always been a reason not to, a schedule. Raymond's preference for driving vacations in the southeast. I booked 2 weeks in Lisbon and the Alentejo region, and I went. I walked cobblestoned streets in the spring heat, ate things I didn't know the names of, and sat by the Tagus River in the evenings, watching the light change on the water. What I came back to on that trip was that I did not regret the fight. Not for a single moment. The alternative, the 800,000 and the silence, would have been its own kind of disappearing, and I had decided in that kitchen in October that I was not going to disappear. Lindy told me on a Thursday call in June, what she knew about Derek. The LLC's tax irregularities had resulted in a formal IRS audit. The investigation was ongoing, but Derek had already retained a tax attorney, and the costs were substantial. A relationship he had been in for 2 years, with someone who had apparently expected to benefit from his forthcoming inheritance, had ended badly in April. He was living in a smaller apartment in Weaverville, and, by all accounts, not doing well. I did not gloat. What I felt was something closer to sadness, not for what he had lost, but for what his years of scheming had revealed about who he had become. The child who handed me garden tools when he was 3. I mourned that child. The man who sat in the closed study mapping my financial erasure was someone else entirely, and I had stopped being responsible for him. Raymond's health had declined more noticeably since the winter. He was living in a smaller house on the eastern side of Asheville, relying on a caregiver who came 3 days a week. I did not visit. I did not call. The door between us had closed, and I had accepted that. What I had instead was this: my house, the rose garden in full bloom by June, Eleanor on alternate weekends, Lindy on Thursdays, Portugal in my memory. A financial future genuinely mine, managed by an advisor Patricia had recommended, growing steadily. In September, I signed up for a watercolor class at the River Arts District. I had not painted since my 30s, and I was not very good. I went every Tuesday morning and sat at a long table with 7 other people of varying ages, and we painted bowls of fruit and light through windows and the river, and I found, to my own mild surprise, that I was happy. Not performing happiness, not working toward it, just present in it the way you can be when you have stopped spending your energy defending something you've already won. Looking back, the thing that strikes me most is how close I came to simply accepting it. They counted on me being too tired, too trusting, too old to fight. They were wrong. What I learned at 74 is this: knowing what you're entitled to isn't greed, it's dignity, and it is never too late to stand up for it. So I'll ask you directly, what would you have done in that kitchen, with the poinsettia on the table and 52 years suddenly up for negotiation? Leave your answer in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know. Thank you for being here. At 72, my husband won our $3.5 million house in court. I'll forbid you from seeing the family and our children, he gloated. I didn't argue and disappeared. A month later, I got a call. Your husband died under suspicious circumstances. What happened? Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always assumed I was the quiet one, the steady one, the woman who baked apple pies on Sunday mornings and kept her opinions to herself at the dinner table. For 47 years of marriage, perhaps I had been exactly that. But quiet doesn't mean blind, and steady doesn't mean broken. My name is Margaret Harlow. Most people call me Peggy. I'm 72 years old, a retired school teacher from Asheville, North Carolina, and this is the story of how I lost everything and then got it all back. Douglas and I had built our life the old-fashioned way. We met in 1976 at a church picnic, married the following spring, and raised 3 children in the same house where I would eventually face the worst betrayal of my life, the house on Ridgecrest Drive. 4 bedrooms, a wraparound porch, a garden I tended for 30 years. It was appraised at $3.5 million when the real estate market climbed. We had paid off the mortgage in 2003. It was ours, or so I believed. Douglas had been a commercial real estate developer. He was good at numbers, good at presentations, and good at making people feel they were getting a fair deal when they weren't. I understood this about him intellectually, the way you understand the weather. I just never thought he'd apply those skills to me. The warning signs I can see now began 2 years before everything collapsed. He started having phone calls in the garage, Not unusual for a retired man with investment properties still to manage, except he'd never done it before. He used to take every call in the kitchen, loud and expansive, narrating his business like a sports commentator. Now he took the phone outside and closed the door. Then the finances shifted. We had always shared a joint checking account alongside our individual accounts. In the spring of 2021, Douglas mentioned, almost in passing, that he was restructuring some assets for tax purposes. He used the word restructuring, the way people use technical language when they don't want to be questioned. I nodded. I shouldn't have. Our daughter, Linda, was the first to notice something off. She came for Easter and pulled me aside while Douglas was carving the ham. "Mom," she said quietly, "has Dad seemed strange to you? He barely looked at us when we arrived, and he keeps checking his phone." I told her he was tired. That's what I said. I told myself the same thing for another 8 months. The moment I can point to, the moment I can say this is where the ground shifted, came on a Tuesday in November 2022. I walked into Douglas's study to bring him coffee and saw his computer screen before he could close it. There was a document open, a legal document. My name was on it, as was the address of our home on Ridgecrest Drive, and there was another name, Carla Simmons, listed as a beneficiary of a proposed property trust. I set the coffee down. I asked who Carla Simmons was. He closed the laptop and said she was a business associate. His voice didn't waver. That scared me more than anything else. I went back to the kitchen and washed the dishes and didn't say another word about it that night. But something had crystallized inside me. It wasn't rage, not yet. It was recognition. The particular clarity that comes when you finally stop making excuses for someone else's behavior. 6 weeks later, I received the court papers. Douglas had filed a lawsuit claiming that the house on Ridgecrest Drive had been purchased primarily with his premarital assets and business income, and that my contribution to the property was minimal. He had apparently spent the better part of 2 years building this legal case. He had an attorney. He had documentation. He had, it turned out, been quietly funneling records and restructuring accounts since 2020. I stood in the foyer of our home holding those papers and read them twice. Then I sat down on the bench by the door, the same bench where I used to help my grandchildren tie their shoes, and I made myself breathe. That evening, Douglas came home for dinner as if nothing had happened. He poured himself a glass of bourbon. He asked what was for dinner, and then he said it. Casually, almost pleasantly. "You should start thinking about where you'll go, Peggy. The legal process takes time, but you're going to lose this house. And if you make this difficult, if you start calling the kids with your version of things, I'll make sure you regret it. I have the means to tie up your access to this family for years. You won't be at Christmas. You won't be at the grandchildren's birthdays. I'll make sure they see only what I show them." He sipped his bourbon. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I looked at him across the kitchen I had cooked in for 30 years and I said, "I understand." He looked almost disappointed that I didn't fight. I wasn't surrendering. I was beginning. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in the bedroom we had shared for decades and stared at the ceiling and took inventory. Not of my feelings, but of my situation. This is what teachers do. We assess. We organize. We make lists. The house on Ridgecrest Drive was valued at $3.5 million. Douglas had filed claiming it was his by right of original investment. I had no income beyond my teacher's pension, $2,240 a month, and Social Security. My name was on the deed, had been since 1978, but Douglas's lawyers, I would soon learn, were arguing that the deed had been amended as part of an estate planning process in 2019, an amendment I had apparently signed. I got up at 4 in the morning and went to the filing cabinet in the spare bedroom, the room I used as a home office. and I found the 2019 estate planning documents. I had signed them. I remembered the occasion. Douglas had sat me down and said our attorney was consolidating the estate structure for efficiency. He'd walked me through several papers quickly, and I had signed where he indicated. I was a school teacher, not a lawyer. I had trusted my husband of 43 years. I sat at the desk in the blue light before dawn and read every word of those documents for the first time. What I found made my stomach turn. Buried in the language was a clause that reclassified the house as an asset held in a trust where Douglas was the sole managing trustee, with my interest reduced to a life estate, meaning I could live there but couldn't claim ownership or sell. And the life estate clause, I noticed, could be revoked under certain specified conditions. Douglas had engineered this. He had sat beside me while I signed it, and he had said nothing. The fear was real. I won't pretend it wasn't. I was 72 years old. I had no savings of my own beyond a modest IRA, roughly $180,000. The pension would keep me alive but not housed, not in any comfort, not in Asheville. If I lost the house, I would lose my community, my garden, my proximity to my grandchildren. I would be an old woman starting over with nothing. But here is what I also knew, sitting at that desk at 4 a.m. I had spent 47 years making things work. I had managed classrooms of 32 students. I had organized school fundraisers, mediated parent disputes, helped children with learning disabilities navigate a system that didn't always see them. I knew how to assess a problem, and I knew how to move through it methodically. I was afraid, and I was going to act anyway. The first decision I made was to tell no one in the family. Not yet. Douglas had already threatened to use the children as leverage. If I called Linda or our son Robert before I had any legal footing, I would be handing Douglas information and time. He would pre-frame the narrative. He would be the reasonable one, the one who had tried to resolve things quietly, and I would be the difficult, emotional wife. The second decision was to find my own attorney, not through any contact Douglas had ever recommended, not through our shared social circle, someone entirely separate. I remembered a woman named Ruth Aronson. She had been the mother of one of my students years ago. I recalled she had become a family law attorney in Asheville. We weren't close, but I had written her daughter a college recommendation letter in 2004, and Ruth had sent me a handwritten note that said, "If you ever need anything, please don't hesitate." I had saved the note. I save most notes. At 8:30 that morning, while Douglas was still asleep, I called Ruth Aronson's office from my cell phone, standing in the backyard by the hydrangeas. Her assistant answered. I said my name and explained that I needed a consultation urgently and privately, and that the matter involved a property dispute with my husband. The assistant put me on hold for 2 minutes. Then Ruth herself came on the line. "Mrs. Harlow," she said, "I remember you. Can you come in today?" I drove to her office at 10 o'clock. I brought the estate documents, the deed, the court filing, and everything I had found in the filing cabinet. I laid them on her conference table, and Ruth Aronson, 61 years old with reading glasses and a yellow legal pad, spent 90 minutes going through everything while I sat and watched her face. When she finished, she took off her glasses and looked at me. "This is not a hopeless situation," she said carefully, "but it was deliberately constructed to look like one. Your husband had help. This is sophisticated work." She explained that the 2019 amendment, while troubling, had potential vulnerabilities. The circumstances of signing, my lack of independent counsel, the way the documents had been presented, could constitute what the law called undue influence. If I could demonstrate that I had signed without understanding what I was signing, and that the terms were materially different from what I had been told, there were grounds to challenge. There's also the matter of where the money actually came from, Ruth said. Marital assets in North Carolina are presumed to be marital property, regardless of source, unless clearly documented otherwise. We'll need to trace the financial history of that house carefully. She slid a retainer agreement across the table. I had $180,000 in an IRA. I was prepared to spend what was necessary. I signed it with a steady hand. The plan was forming. Challenge the 2019 amendment on the grounds of undue influence, trace the true financial history of the property, and expose whatever Carla Simmons had to do with all of it. 3 threads. I would pull all 3 simultaneously. Douglas thought I had surrendered. He was mistaken. The week after I retained Ruth, I went about my life with careful normalcy. This was perhaps the most difficult performance of my life. And I had once taught 8th grade English for 11 years, which requires considerable theatrical skill. I made breakfast. I tended the garden. I asked Douglas about his day. I did not mention lawyers or documents or Carla Simmons. I watched him relax back into his assumption that I was overwhelmed and passive. Meanwhile, Ruth's paralegal sent a formal discovery request to Douglas's legal team, which triggered the official legal process. The moment those papers were served, I knew the clock had changed. Douglas would know I had representation. What he wouldn't know, not yet, was how much I had already assembled. Ruth had also connected me with a forensic accountant named Phil Garrett. Phil was 63, meticulous, and had spent 20 years untangling financial misrepresentations in divorce cases. His job was to trace the actual source of the funds used to purchase and maintain the Ridgecrest Drive property from 1978 onward. I gave Phil access to every financial document I could locate: bank statements, tax returns going back to 1980, the original mortgage papers, renovation receipts, property tax records. I found boxes in the attic I hadn't opened in 15 years. I photographed everything and sent it to Phil's secure portal. What he began to find was important. The house had been purchased in 1978 for $87,000. The down payment, $22,000, had come from a joint savings account that both Douglas and I had contributed to during our first 2 years of marriage. My teacher's salary had gone into that account, alongside Douglas's early contracting income. Phil could document this from the original bank records. More significantly, the major renovation we'd done in 1998, the addition that had significantly raised the property value, had been funded partly by an inheritance I received when my mother died. $40,000. I had the original estate documents from my mother's probate. Douglas's lawyers had not accounted for this. They couldn't, because it didn't appear in the documents Douglas had controlled. This was the first thread coming loose. The second came from an unexpected direction. I had been thinking about Carla Simmons since I saw her name on Douglas's screen. I didn't rush this. I did what I used to tell my students to do when approaching a research question. Start with what you can verify from public records. Carla Simmons, it turned out, had a professional presence that was not difficult to find. She was 45, worked in commercial property management in Charlotte, and had a LinkedIn profile that listed several properties under management, including 2 that I recognized as properties Douglas had developed in the late 2000s. She wasn't a new associate. She had been in his orbit for at least 15 years. I sat with that for a while. I also found, through Ruth's investigative contacts, that Carla Simmons had been listed as a co-signatory on a property purchase in Charlotte in 2021, a small investment property. The purchase price was $340,000. The funds had been wired from an LLC I had never heard of, Harlow Coastal Investments, LLC. Douglas had never mentioned Harlow Coastal Investments to me. Ruth filed a formal motion to compel full financial disclosure, naming the LLC. This was the point of no return. Douglas's attorney called Ruth within 2 hours of the filing. The call, Ruth described to me afterward, was tense. Douglas's attorney, a man named Frank Whitfield, expressed surprise at the aggressive posture of my legal team, given what he called the straightforward nature of the asset arrangement. Ruth responded that she looked forward to Mr. Whitfield explaining the straightforward nature of an undisclosed LLC in discovery. That evening, Douglas came home and his manner had changed. He wasn't pleasant. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at me with something that wasn't quite anger. It was calculation. "You got a lawyer," he said. "Yes," I said. "Who?" "That's between me and my lawyer," I said, and turned back to the stove. He stood there for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You're making a mistake, Peggy. You don't understand the full picture here. When this is over, you'll have cost yourself everything trying to fight something you can't win." I stirred the soup. "All right, Douglas," I said. He left the room. I exhaled slowly. 2 days later, the direct evidence arrived. Phil Garrett called me in the morning. His voice was professionally measured, but I had learned to read his pauses. "Mrs. Harlow," he said, "I need you to come in today if possible. I've found something significant." I sat across from him that afternoon as he laid out a series of financial transfers. Beginning in 2018, 4 years prior, Douglas had been systematically transferring funds from jointly held investment accounts into Harlow Coastal Investments, LLC. Over 4 years, the total transferred was approximately $890,000. The LLC had then used those funds for property investments in Carla Simmons's name and for payments to accounts Phil was still tracing. The transfers had been done incrementally, $11,000 here, $8,000 there, always below the threshold that would require formal reporting. Deliberate, methodical. Douglas had been draining our marital estate for 4 years to build a parallel financial life with another woman. I looked at Phil's spreadsheet for a long time. "Is this enough?" I asked. "For financial misconduct in the marriage? Yes," he said. "This is enough." I thanked him and drove home and sat in my car in the driveway for 10 minutes before going inside. In North Carolina, marital misconduct, including the dissipation of marital assets, is relevant to equitable distribution. Ruth had explained this to me. What Douglas had done wasn't just morally devastating, it was legally actionable. It changed the entire landscape of the property dispute. He had built a trap for me. What he hadn't accounted for was that I would find the mechanism. Ruth filed the amended counterclaim on a Thursday morning. The filing was extensive. It detailed the undisclosed LLC, the $890,000 in transferred marital funds, the 4-year pattern of financial concealment, and Carla Simmons's role as beneficiary of those transfers. It formally challenged the 2019 estate amendment on grounds of undue influence and lack of independent counsel. It requested a full forensic accounting of all marital assets, including properties held under Harlow Coastal Investments. It also included, at Ruth's recommendation, a motion to freeze the LLC's assets pending the outcome of litigation. By Friday afternoon, Douglas's composure had fractured. He came into the kitchen while I was reading and dropped a sheaf of papers on the table in front of me. His hand was shaking slightly. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice was controlled, but barely. "Protecting my interests," I said. "The way you protected yours. You have no idea what you've done." He sat down across from me, and his manner shifted, not to anger, but to something colder and more deliberate. "Peggy, listen to me. You've just made things very complicated for both of us. If you push this, the IRS gets involved. The asset freeze affects accounts you have access to, too. You'll be cutting off your own nose." Ruth explained the process to me, I said. He stared at me. Then, "Who's helping you? Who put you up to this?" "I put myself up to this, Douglas." He left the room, and I heard him on the phone within minutes, voice low and tight, in the garage. The door between the house and garage, I noticed, was not quite fully closed. I didn't move toward it. I didn't need to. His panic was information enough. The following Tuesday, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. I almost didn't answer. When I did, a woman's voice said, "Is this Margaret Harlow?" "It is," I said. "My name is Carla Simmons." I sat down. Her tone was not hostile. It was practiced, controlled in the way that people sound when they have decided exactly what they want to accomplish before picking up the phone. She said she wanted me to understand that Douglas had always intended to make proper arrangements for me, that what was happening in the courts was a misunderstanding, that she had no desire to see me harmed. I listened to the entire speech. Then I said, "Miss Simmons, I'd encourage you to direct any further communication to my attorney, Ruth Aronson. Have a good day." I hung up. Within the hour, Ruth called me. Frank Whitfield, Douglas's attorney, had contacted her requesting an urgent settlement discussion. He was proposing that I accept a lump sum payment of $400,000 in exchange for dropping all claims and vacating the property within 60 days. $400,000 for a $3.5 million house and 47 years. What should I tell him? Ruth asked. There was something in her voice that told me she already knew my answer. "Tell him no," I said. Ruth did not attempt to talk me into compromise. She said, "I'll let him know." 20 minutes later, I received a text from Douglas's personal number. It read, "You are going to regret this. I have things on you that will make you look very bad in front of the children. Don't test me." I photographed the text and forwarded it to Ruth immediately. "That," Ruth said when she received it, "is harassment, and it's going into the court record." The next blow came from a direction I hadn't anticipated. Douglas called our son Robert. Robert was 51, lived in Raleigh, and had always had a closer relationship with his father. 2 days after the text, Robert drove to Asheville and appeared at my door, looking uncomfortable. He came in and sat at the kitchen table and told me that his father had said I was trying to destroy the family with a frivolous lawsuit, that I was being manipulated by a predatory attorney, and that the house dispute was a private matter that should have been handled quietly. I let him finish. Then I opened my laptop and showed him Phil Garrett's forensic report. I showed him the $890,000. I showed him the LLC and Carla Simmons's name on the Charlotte property. Robert sat in silence for a long time. "Dad told you none of this," I said. "No," Robert said quietly. "I didn't think so." He left 3 hours later with a copy of Phil's summary and a request from me to keep it between us until the legal process concluded. He agreed. I believed him. The escalation had been real, and for a few days it rattled me more than I expected. The text threat, the call from Carla, the attempt to turn Robert against me. These were not the desperate moves of a man who was confident. These were the moves of a man who now understood. The ground had shifted. I drove to the Blue Ridge Parkway on a Saturday morning and sat in my car at an overlook for 2 hours. The mountains in November were gray and brown and enormous. I let myself cry once, briefly, and then I bought a coffee at a gas station and drove home. I needed 3 days. Not to doubt, I was past doubt. I needed the particular rest that comes from having done something irreversible and consequential and right. I spent those days in the garden, in my reading chair, on the phone with Linda, to whom I said only that things were being handled. I walked in the neighborhood in the mornings. I slept. By the following Monday, I was ready again. The temptation came dressed as concern. 10 days after the failed settlement offer, Frank Whitfield sent a formal letter, through Ruth, proposing a new arrangement. This time, the offer was $750,000 and a dignified transition period of 4 months before I would need to vacate the house. The letter used language like mutual respect and recognition of your contributions to the marriage. It also subtly referenced my age. It noted that prolonged litigation can be physically and emotionally taxing, particularly for individuals of retirement age. I read the phrase individuals of retirement age twice. Ruth called it a soft intimidation tactic dressed as generosity. I called it an insult with a bow on it. I said no. What interested me more was the observation I'd begun to notice in the days that followed. Douglas had stopped confronting me directly. The texts had stopped after I documented them. He was no longer coming into rooms where I was sitting and making declarations. He was watching, moving more carefully. I could feel it. The shift from offense to surveillance. He was waiting to see what I would do next. This was, in its way, a small victory. A man who expected to steamroll someone doesn't shift to watching them unless he's begun to suspect the steamroller is going in the wrong direction. But I knew that surveillance meant he was also gathering, looking for weaknesses, looking for anything he could use. Which was why the next thing I did was perhaps the most important and the most human thing in this entire ordeal. I asked for help, not legal help, not financial, the kind that doesn't appear in court filings. I called Patricia Weaver. Patricia had been my closest friend since 1985. We had taught at the same middle school for 12 years, survived the same vice principal, and raised our children through the same years. She was 70, recently widowed, and sharp in the way that decades of teaching other people's children makes a person sharp. I had not told her anything about what was happening because I hadn't wanted to burden anyone before I had solid footing. I called her on a Wednesday evening and told her everything. All of it. She listened without interrupting. She had always been a magnificent listener. And when I finished, she was quiet for 4 seconds. "I'll be there Saturday," she said. She drove up from Hendersonville. We sat on the porch with tea, and she listened again to the details. And this time, she asked precise, practical questions. How was I eating? Was I sleeping? What did the next 60 days of legal process look like? Did I need someone to drive me to appointments? She also said something that I have returned to many times since. "Peggy, you have done exactly the right thing at every step. What you're feeling right now isn't weakness. It's the weight of a large thing done correctly." I held on to that, but Patricia did more than be present. She was, it turned out, a connector. Her nephew Martin was a retired judge from Buncombe County, civil court, family matters, 30 years on the bench. He'd retired in 2019. Patricia asked if I would be willing to have coffee with him, not for legal advice, but for what she called perspective from someone who has seen all the ways these things go. I met Martin Weaver at a diner in Weaverville the following Monday. He was 73, unhurried, and ordered decaf with 2 sugars. He listened to my summary and asked several careful questions. "Your attorney filed the asset freeze motion?" he said. "Yes, last week." "And the forensic accounting is documented?" "Yes." He nodded. He didn't tell me what would happen, but he told me what he had observed in 30 years of family court, that cases with documented financial misconduct and clear paper trails rarely, in his experience, ended badly for the party who had been wronged, provided they had competent representation and were willing to hold the line under pressure. "The pressure will come again," he said. "It always does, right before the other side realizes they can't win." "I'm expecting it," I said. He looked at me over his coffee cup with something I can only call recognition. "Good," he said. Patricia also quietly told Linda. I had asked her not to tell the grandchildren and not to create alarm, just to let Linda know the true shape of what was happening, since Linda had been worried and confused and receiving Douglas's version of events through Robert, who was himself still processing what he'd seen. Linda called me that night. She was crying. Then she was furious. Then she was very calm. She asked what she could do. I told her to simply be herself and to not let her father see that her allegiance had clarified. To be neutral in his presence for now. Linda was a middle school counselor. She understood the value of strategic neutrality. I had started this alone, in the dark at 4 in the morning. I was no longer alone. The legal process was moving. The financial misconduct was documented. My attorney was formidable. My support was solid. And Douglas, who had once believed I would quietly accept an offer and disappear, was watching from a distance and, I suspected, beginning to genuinely understand the situation he had created. I let him watch. There was nothing in my days that would reassure him. They came on a Sunday. I was in the garden when I heard the car in the driveway. I recognized Douglas's Land Rover. I also recognized the car behind it. A dark blue sedan I didn't know. I set down my trowel and removed my gardening gloves and walked to the back gate. Douglas came through first. He was dressed well, the way he dressed for meetings that mattered. Behind him was a man I hadn't seen before. 50s, dark suit, briefcase. And behind the man came Carla Simmons. I stood at the gate and waited. "Peggy," Douglas said. His voice was warm, that particular warmth he had always been able to produce on demand, the boardroom warmth, the warmth that preceded a negotiation he intended to win. "I'd like to talk. No lawyers. Just family." "Carla Simmons is not family," I said. "She's here as a witness," he said. "And this is Richard Crane. He's a mediator." "I have an attorney," I said. "Any mediation goes through her." "This isn't formal mediation." Douglas stepped closer. "Peggy, I know things have gotten out of hand. I want to make it right. We can settle this in a way that works for everyone." He paused, "Including the children." I looked at him. "Come in," I said. "I'll make coffee." I chose the kitchen table, not the sitting room. I wanted the flat surface and the practical light. I set out 4 cups and poured from the carafe and sat across from all 3 of them. Richard Crane set a folder on the table and opened it. Douglas spoke first. He was thoughtful. He acknowledged that the financial situation had become more complicated than intended. He expressed, and this cost him something visible, what he called regret for the way things had unfolded. He said the offer had now been revised again. Richard Crane slid a document across the table. $1 million, transfer of a smaller property, a rental house Douglas owned in Weaverville, value approximately $380,000, and a lifetime right to remain in the Ridgecrest Drive house until my death, though ownership would transfer to the trust. A lifetime right to remain in my own home, as a guest, effectively. I looked at the document for a long moment. Then Carla Simmons spoke. Until that moment, she had been silent. Her voice, when it came, was even and precise. "Mrs. Harlow, I understand this is painful, but I want you to consider what continued litigation will cost you, not just financially. Your grandchildren are going to see their grandparents in a court battle. Your son Robert told Douglas that this has already caused real distress in the family." She paused. "You're 72, she said. "You've had a long, full life. Is this how you want to spend what's left of it?" I set down my coffee cup. It was the condescension I had been waiting for. The real face behind the mediation language. I had spent 47 years being managed by a man who knew exactly which words would make me feel small, and I recognized the technique immediately in someone he had chosen. I looked at Carla Simmons for a moment, then at Douglas. "Douglas," I said, "I have a forensic accounting of $890,000 removed from our joint assets over 4 years. I have documentation of an undisclosed LLC used to make investments in Ms. Simmons's name. I have a 2019 estate document signed under conditions that Ruth Aronson believes constitute undue influence, and I have a text message from your phone that my attorney has submitted to the court record. I folded my hands on the table. What I don't have is any reason to sign this document. Douglas's warmth disappeared, not gradually, all at once. You're going to lose, he said. The boardroom voice was gone. Whitfield has handled dozens of cases more complicated than this. You're a retired school teacher who found a small-town family lawyer. You have no idea what the next 18 months of this process will look like. Then I'll learn, I said. Carla Simmons made one more attempt. She said carefully that if I pressed the LLC issue, there could be complications for other parties that would reflect badly on the whole family. An implication without content, designed to feel like a threat without being specific enough to be actionable. I simply looked at her and said nothing. Richard Crane began to gather his papers. He looked, I noted, faintly uncomfortable. Perhaps he had expected an easier afternoon. Douglas stood up. You're making the worst mistake of your life. I've made a few, I said, mostly involving trust. They left. I heard the cars back out of the driveway and then the quiet returned. I stood at the kitchen window for a long time. I'm not going to pretend I was purely calm. There was fear in me. The low, cold kind, not the panicked kind. Douglas was right that Frank Whitfield was an experienced attorney. The next year of legal proceedings would be expensive, grinding, and uncertain. There was no guarantee of outcome. But the fear did what fear sometimes does when you've already decided. It clarified. It reminded me what was actually at stake. Not just the house, my home, my name on a deed. 47 years of a life that deserved to be accounted for honestly. I went back to the garden. I picked up my trowel. I turned the soil around the late-season chrysanthemums. The fear fed the resolve. I was going to see this through. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday in February. Ruth had prepared me over 3 sessions in her conference room. She sat across from me and played the role of opposing counsel, asking questions in the sharp, deliberately destabilizing way that Frank Whitfield would ask them. I answered. She pushed. I answered again. By the 3rd session, she leaned back and said, "You're going to be fine." "I know," I said. The deposition was held in Whitfield's offices in downtown Asheville. Glass-walled, corporate, designed to convey authority. Douglas was present, seated to one side with Whitfield. Carla Simmons had been deposed separately the week before. Ruth had conducted that session and described it to me as productive. I sat across from Frank Whitfield with Ruth beside me, and a court reporter at the end of the table, and I looked at Douglas once when I entered the room. He looked back. Neither of us nodded. Whitfield began with the expected foundation. How long had I been married? What was my educational background? Did I understand the documents I signed in 2019? I answered each question precisely. One of the things Ruth had taught me, answer exactly what is asked. Nothing more. Then Whitfield moved to the amendment. "Mrs. Harlow, is it correct that you signed the 2019 estate amendment voluntarily and without coercion?" "I signed it," I said. "I did not understand its contents fully at the time of signing. I was not given independent legal advice before signing, which I was not told was available to me. I was told the documents were routine estate maintenance." "Did anyone prevent you from reading the documents?" "The documents were presented in a setting designed to suggest they were administrative formalities." My husband moved through them quickly. The session lasted approximately 25 minutes and covered 6 separate documents. I was not given time to read each one in full. Whitfield shifted. "You are a college-educated woman. You were a professional educator for 31 years, I said. "Don't you think a reasonable person in your position?" "I think a reasonable person who has been married for 43 years and trusts her husband might not demand independent legal review of what he describes as routine paperwork," I said. "Yes." Ruth did not object. She didn't need to. The answer stood. Whitfield moved to the LLC. He attempted to establish that I had been aware of Harlow Coastal Investments, that I had, in fact, been consulted on its formation. He showed me a document. It was a consent form with my signature. I looked at it carefully. "Can you tell me what you're showing me?" I asked. Whitfield said it was a consent form for the formation of the LLC, signed by me in 2019. "May I see the full document?" I asked. Ruth requested the complete filing from Whitfield's paralegal. It took 4 minutes to produce. When I had it in front of me, I read the top portion. "This is a consent form for a real estate investment vehicle," I said. "It does not mention Harlow Coastal Investments by name. It uses the phrasing potential investment entity to be formed at a later date as determined appropriate." I did not know what entity I was consenting to. I was told it was related to a possible future rental property arrangement. There was a pause in the room. "Is that your signature?" Whitfield asked. "It appears to be," I said. "But a signature on a consent to an unnamed future entity is not knowledge of the specific entity formed, its activities, or the transfers made through it. I had no knowledge of Harlow Coastal Investments, LLC, until Phil Garrett's forensic accounting report." Whitfield tried 3 more angles. Each time, Ruth had prepared me for the shape of the question, and each time my answer was specific, factual, and impossible to usefully expand upon through cross-examination. Then Ruth had her turn. She asked me to describe, in my own words, the events of the 2019 signing session. I did, in precise detail, the kitchen table, the 6 documents, the 25 minutes. Douglas telling me the attorney had reviewed everything and it was all standard. She asked me to describe the financial contributions I had made to the Ridgecrest Drive property over the years. I described them. The down payment from joint savings. The 1998 renovation funded in part by my mother's estate. The years of household maintenance funded by my teacher's salary, which had freed Douglas's income for investment. She asked me if I had ever been informed of transfers from our joint accounts to a separately held LLC. "No," I said. "Were you ever informed of the existence of Harlow Coastal Investments, LLC?" "No." "Were you ever informed of the Charlotte property purchased in Carla Simmons's name using funds from that LLC?" "No." Douglas, I noticed from the corner of my eye, had stopped looking at me. He was looking at the table in front of him. Ruth saved the text message for last. She read it into the record. "You are going to regret this. I have things on you that will make you look very bad in front of the children. Don't test me. Mrs. Harlow, did you receive this text from your husband's number?" "Yes." "How did you respond?" "I forwarded it to my attorney." There was silence. Whitfield attempted a brief redirect. He asked whether Douglas had ever physically threatened me, whether I had experienced any fear for my safety. "No," I said. "He threatened my relationships with my children and grandchildren. He threatened my reputation within the family. These are not physical harms, but they are the tools used to keep someone compliant." I paused. They didn't work. When the deposition concluded, Ruth and I walked to her car in the parking structure. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "In 30 years of family law, I have deposed perhaps 6 people who did it the way you just did." "Is that good?" I said. "It's extraordinary," she said. "I sat in the passenger seat and felt something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, something quieter. The particular satisfaction of having known exactly who you are when someone spends 3 hours trying to make you forget." I called Patricia from the parking structure to tell her it was done. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Ready," I said. The ruling came on a Friday morning in late April. Ruth called me at 8:45. I was in the kitchen, coffee in hand, standing at the window looking at the garden. The forsythia had come in yellow and full. The spring had been warm. "Peggy," Ruth said, and I could hear it in the single word. "We won." I sat down. The judge's ruling was thorough. 43 pages. Ruth walked me through the key elements over the phone, and then sent the full document by email, which I printed and read at the kitchen table over the course of 2 hours, a second cup of coffee going cold beside me. The 2019 estate amendment had been voided. The court found that the circumstances of signing, lack of independent counsel, the volume of documents presented in a single brief session, my reasonable reliance on my husband's characterization of the document's nature, constituted undue influence. The amendment was treated as if it had never existed. The Ridgecrest Drive property reverted to its pre-amendment status, jointly held marital property, subject to equitable distribution. On equitable distribution, the court's analysis of the marital estate was decisive. Phil Garrett's forensic accounting had documented $890,000 removed from marital accounts and directed to Harlow Coastal Investments, LLC, over 4 years. The court found this constituted dissipation of marital assets, a legal term meaning the wasteful or intentional depletion of marital property by one spouse. In North Carolina, dissipation is specifically accounted for in equitable distribution. The court also recognized my direct financial contributions to the Ridgecrest Drive property, the joint savings used for the down payment, my mother's estate funds used in the 1998 renovation, and the economic contribution of my teacher's salary in supporting household expenses and freeing Douglas's income for investment over the decades of our marriage. The equitable distribution calculation was not 50-50. Given the dissipation finding and given my documented contributions, the court awarded me 62% of the total marital estate. The Ridgecrest Drive property was awarded to me outright. I read that line 3 times. Douglas was awarded his investment properties, his remaining business accounts, and his personal assets, minus the funds that the court required to be returned from the LLC as a corrective measure for the dissipation. His share, after the corrective calculation, came to approximately $1.9 million in various forms. My share, including the house, came to approximately $3.1 million. He received considerably less than if he had behaved decently, much less than he would have received from a straightforward equal split. Ruth filed to have Douglas's legal fees assessed against him on the grounds that the litigation had been initiated on the basis of the fraudulent 2019 amendment. The court agreed. He would pay his own legal costs. The text message: "You're going to regret this. I have things on you that will make you look very bad in front of the children. Don't test me," was included in the court's findings as an example of the intimidation tactics employed against me. It did not carry separate legal consequences, but it was in the record, permanently. Frank Whitfield withdrew from Douglas's case shortly after the ruling. I heard this from Ruth, who heard it from the court clerk. The manner of withdrawal was not explained. Carla Simmons was not named as a party to the case. She had never been married to Douglas, but the court's record of the LLC and the Charlotte property was public. I have no knowledge of what happened between her and Douglas after the ruling. I didn't need to know. What I needed to do was change the locks. I did this on a Saturday morning in May, 2 weeks after Douglas vacated the premises following the court-ordered timeline. I hired a locksmith named Gary, who came with 2 assistants and replaced every lock in 3 hours. I stood on the porch in the May sunshine while they worked and drank my coffee and watched the dogwood. When Gary handed me the new keys, he had no way of knowing what they meant. He handed them over with a professional smile and a receipt. I held them for a moment. My keys, my house, my name on the deed, undisputed, unencumbered, clear. Linda and Robert came for dinner that evening. Robert had been honest with me since the day I showed him Phil's report. He had not, by his own account, spoken to Douglas beyond necessity since then. He was struggling with it, the complexity of what his father had done, the years of an image that had been constructed over a lie. We didn't resolve that over one dinner. We wouldn't resolve it quickly. But he was there. Linda had brought her children, my grandchildren, Eli, 12, and Nora, 9. They ran through the garden and Nora picked a single forsythia branch and brought it to me. I put it in a glass of water on the kitchen table. After dinner, when the grandchildren were watching television and Robert had stepped outside with a glass of wine, Linda came and sat beside me. "Are you all right?" she said. I thought about the answer. "I'm better than all right," I said. "I'm still here." And then the call came. It was a June morning, 5 weeks after the ruling. My cell phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail. I answered on the last ring. A man identified himself as a detective with the Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Department. He said he was calling regarding Douglas Harlow. He said Douglas had been found in his Charlotte apartment. He had apparently rented one near Carla Simmons's property after vacating Ridgecrest Drive. He had been found by a neighbor who had noticed his mail accumulating. The cause of death at that point was under investigation. The circumstances were described as unusual. I sat down in the kitchen chair, the chair by the window. The forsythia was still in the glass. "When?" I said. "Approximately 3 days ago," the detective said. "We're contacting family members. I'm sorry for your loss." I thanked him. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long while after hanging up. The investigation concluded, several weeks later, that Douglas had died of a cardiac event, a massive heart attack. He had been alone. He was 74 years old, overweight, under sustained financial and legal stress, and had, apparently, not spoken to a doctor in over 2 years. There were no strange circumstances in the end. There was only a man who had spent years building a false life, watched it collapse, and did not survive the collapse. I did not go to the funeral. His brother arranged it. Robert attended. Linda did not, and I did not ask her to. I went to the garden instead. The summer after the ruling was the quietest summer I had known in years. Not quiet in the way of emptiness. Quiet in the way of land that has been worked and is now resting. I woke to birdsong and light through my bedroom window. My bedroom window. My house. Some mornings, I sat on the porch for an hour before doing anything else, simply because I could. I returned to the list I had made at 4 in the morning in November and crossed each item off. The house, mine. My grandchildren, mine. My standing in the family, restored. My sense of myself, intact, and stronger for having been tested. I hired a landscaping student named Maya to help build the cutting garden I had always wanted. By August, the new beds were in: dahlias, zinnias, cosmos. Ruth Aronson had become a friend. Through her, I met a woman named Diane, 68, who had just discovered her husband's hidden finances and didn't believe she had the standing to fight. I told her about the 4 in the morning inventory. I told her about the new keys. "I didn't think I was the kind of person who does this," she said. "Neither did I said. "It turns out the kind of person who does this is someone who decides to." Patricia visited in July. Robert came monthly, working slowly through his grief. Linda brought the grandchildren. Nora ate more pound cake batter than went into the pan, and I said nothing. Carla Simmons ended her arrangement with Douglas shortly after the ruling. The Charlotte property was liquidated. The LLC dissolved. I thought of her occasionally, not with hatred, but pity. She had built something on a man's lies. Douglas had believed I would take $400,000 and disappear. He had spent 47 years mistaking my quiet for absence of self. He confused the appearance of peace with surrender. The Café au lait dahlias were extraordinary that September, brown and gold, the variety I had doubted. I cut them every Friday and placed them in the blue ceramic vase on the kitchen table. The quiet ones remember everything. If you're sitting somewhere right now feeling like everything has been taken, write a list. That list is where it begins. I lost faith in the man I had trusted most. I did not lose faith in myself. That difference was everything. Douglas believed 47 years of quiet meant I had nothing left. He was wrong. Quiet is not surrender, steady is not weakness, and it is never, never too late to stand up. What would you have done in my place? Leave a comment. It helps other women find this story who may need it most. Thank you for being here.